First of all, I want to echo Andreas in thanking the organizing of the workshop. I was here early this year to present the book, and the book is inspired by insights coming from political economy and feminism that see, particularly in Jairus and Silvia's work, and their synergies, a way to explain the ways in which one can understand processes of exploitation in the sweatshop. So for me to be invited in a workshop that had them as keynotes, it was just tremendously exciting. So I'm very grateful. Originally I thought I would present a recent work I've finished on how we conceptualize the way in which social reproduction is value producing. And I think I'm still going to touch upon some of those issues here, but because of my location as having engaged with both debates on forms of exploitation as well as social reproduction, I thought that perhaps instead it was useful for me to sort of talk a little bit about the ways in which I put some insights from Jairus' work and some insights from Silvia's work and more broadly the housework debate work together to speak about what we're seeing in the world of work today. And of course, you'll forgive me, I'll make some illustration from the sweatshop regime, from the sweatshop in India, because that in a sense epitomizes a lot of, in many ways, many of the informalized labor relations we see today. So the scope of the presentation is to place in conversation the literature on forms of exploitation and social reproduction, and particularly to show the ways in which they intersect. And I think by the time the days going ahead, it's clear how many issues in fact are intersecting. And particularly, I want to show the intersection in relation to discussing, or like both approaches, questioning the boundaries of exploitation. So there is actually a way to rethink categories and what is in and what is out that really it is the debate about. And I think it's a crucial debate both for theory as well as practice and politics. Now, both these traditions see exploitation as a complex category and concept which is structured and experienced in different ways, forms, and shaping as well as being shaped by different social relations. So I'll first provide you some highlights of what I think the two traditions do in relation to our conceptualization of exploitation. And then I proceed to propose a few ways in which I think is very clear how one can combine these insights, and particularly providing some examples from the sweatshop regime. I'll discuss how labor seems to be always experiencing exploitation based on their reproductive and social profile. So the moments of labor commodification and labor exploitation being a unitary moment that actually banks on a social profile of the individual to carve particularly structured exploitation rates, which in a sense speaks about the debate on super exploitation, or to my knowledge it poses itself as a critique to the concept of super exploitation, and that draws on some of Silvia's insight as the body as a machine under capitalism. And then the second is the way in which different forms of exploitation as we see it in the concrete today, because this is what this presentation tried to speak to, how this concept and categories come to life in the world of the contemporary, how these different forms of exploitation, I would say, involve different relations of social reproduction. I will also touch upon issues of value in the way in which social reproduction structure directly exploitation rates in relation to the different forms in which exploitation manifests. And finally, I'll just conclude with some reflection on liberal freedom that perhaps will establish some connection with what Jens has already argued. Now, I was following with great interest the debate this morning when Jairus was talking, because effectively, to me, the exchange between him and Benno was also a debate around how we define capitalism that was indirectly sort of raised as a question but not really addressed. And my reading, I hope, I'm sorry it's not here, and I hope I'm not misquoting, but, well, I doubt I am, but anyway, it's always best to have the person present. Giles would define capitalism as a mode of production broadly characterized by processes of extraction of labor surplus. So, of course, it's a much more flexible sort of way to define capitalism that already sets, by the very definition, the fact that free or wage labor is only one way in which exploitation actually manifests. And this brings on a number of knock-on effects on the type of theorization. The first being that, of course, free labor as well is endemic to capitalism. So free wage labor is only one way in which exploitation manifests, and also the fact that they too might not necessarily be in transit, which many of us working on actual contemporary forms of exploitation will totally agree on, because there are just certain ways in which we observe labor subsumption which doesn't happen in real terms, that do not seem to go anywhere anytime soon. Now, this allows a non-orthodox understanding of capitalism and allows to show its global feature and the fact that it manifests itself, is always manifests itself, and still does manifest itself in very different ways. So in a sense, already serves the purpose of recenter Marx away from Eurocentric reading of what he was actually trying to say, and also recuperating the history of non-Western countries in their own right, rather than as sort of a shifted experience from an idealized original core. Also, it speaks very much to the actual experience of exploitation worldwide, and in a sense, it's a view that expands the boundaries of exploitation and where to study it, making these boundaries effectively much more porous, and also relaxing the perimeters of what we identify the abode of production, and which are the relations that are fundamental to us to actually study exploitation, which of course is a sort of quite a complex debate to be had. Now, by similar, along, in my view, similar lines, the social reproduction analysis, particularly that is sparked in the 1970s and 80s with the work of Silvia, Maria Rosa Dalla Costa, Maria Mies, Antonella Picchio, and others, had an entirely subversive take on exploitation. And of course, what we can say about the early Housework debate was it literally brought exploitation home in different ways. So on the one hand, Silvia's work considering the history of primitive accumulation rather than as a process that only saw the separation of producers from the means of production as a gender and racialized processes that aimed at the reconstitution and the sort of reproduction of difference, and also the focus on housework as a realm, well, as an example of exploitative relations in and on itself, even if unpaid, which in a sense already question what the wage really represented, and the early social reproduction analysis did an extraordinary work on the wage and what it actually did in relation to setting a specific laborist or productivist conceptualization of ethics at the very center of our understanding of capitalism, with a huge number of people that start lying outside the boundaries of capitalism. Women are half the human race. Labor relations in the so-called majority world account for 2/3 of the entire working population. So, you know what I'm trying to get here. So, for instance, the work of Antonella Picchio actually highlighted how throughout the classics, not just in Marx, but starting from Adam Smith and Ricardo, we see this misinterpretation of the wage as the actual value of labor as opposed to the cost of labor in production, which already sets the basis for a number of misconceptions that then will be carried out in relation to the conflation of exploitation with productivity that, you know, takes particularly a sort of very central role in stagist analysis, even radical stages analysis a la Bill Warren, for instance. So according to this tradition, exploitation is highly discriminatory and a differential process since its very inception, experienced differently on the basis of gender and race, co-constituted in the home, so that quite famously, Sylvia and others stressing how the social factory starts from the kitchen and the bedroom, and with the body plays as both as a physical as well as a social machine aimed at the reproduction of the workers of tomorrow, as well as the incorporation of the rhythm, the new rhythms of the new capitalist system. So this corpus of literature collapses the fictitious separation between productive and reproductive spheres. Now, of course, I would say that a tradition that rejects, or a theory that rejects the separation between productive and reproductive realms and spheres, and one that rejects the reification of wage labor as the only form of exploitation that we shall recognize under capitalism, are very, very compatible projects indeed, and I think sets the basis of why I use these two traditions together in trying to grapple with the ways in which we can sort of talk about exploitative relations in today's global sweatshops. Now, it's also a very fruitful way to me to combine Marxism and feminism and the basis to explore different links between the ways in which exploitation manifests and social reproduction in actual ways that learn from the housework debate but go well beyond it. Because to me, the lessons from the housework debate, if you look at the way in which the world of work is structured at present, can be actually scaled up significantly, and they actually lead us to question more profoundly the ways in which we should understand surplus value extraction and exploitation rates in current context. So I will just give you two examples on the ways in which forms of exploitation and social reproduction have very specific links and useful links for us to think through the ways in which labor relations appear today. And the first is looking at the way in which there is a correspondence between labor exploitation and the reproductive and social profiles of the workers involved. So not only we have that different sets of workers experience exploitation in different ways, and this taking a very specific form that is either wage or semi-wage labor or housework or production across India, if we look at the ways in which the sweatshop work, but also we see that these have a key implication for what we can say about the reproductive arrangements that these workers are incorporated into. So starting from the north here, these are pretty much the centers that I cover in my book, from north to south. There are 8 main centers, but to be broad and more general, I would say that there is a northern part where the sweatshop is characterized by combinations of factory and non-factory labor that see in factories temporary migrants, male migrants that come from villages and different peri-urban enclaves, and they either circulate back home in villages during lean season on a yearly basis, or they continue circulating across industrial areas, and the last survey reveals that we're talking about 60% of the workforce actually not staying in the same industrial unit for more than a year. So it's an extremely mobile labor force that we're looking at, and entirely masculine, and this is complemented by the presence of hundreds of thousands of households which are incorporated into the production process, either as single home workers, this type of that Maria Mies was describing in the lace maker of Narsapur, or where the entire household is in fact incorporated as a petty commodity production unit. So there is extremely diverse ways in which we see processes of labor subsumption, which in a sense speaks directly in concrete terms to what Jairus was talking about this morning, and while we talk about the ways in which formal and real subsumption actually take place under capitalism, they're not only not in sort of rival terms, but also there is an extremely porous continuum between the two that we can observe. Now, the South is a very different beast in a sense that you find mostly classic factory labor, and here is where you mostly find women workers, the classic maquila-like model that you would expect to be found in other parts of the South. Now, it's the ways in which exploitation is experienced, so the type of forms it takes and it's corresponded in different forms of employment, it's hugely dependent upon the social profile, the reproductive profile of the workforce, in ways that actually sort of illuminate the ways in which you should understand class as always co-constituted by social oppression. The second ways in which I think the two concepts of forms of exploitation and social reproduction come together in explaining the forms of work when we look at the concrete, when we look at concrete experiences of exploitation, is the fact that forms of exploitation themselves that involve very different reproductive arrangements that make them possible, that made it possible to regenerate them. So if we go back up north here, you have this highly mobile labor force composed of male migrants that actually is only partially dispossessed. So, I mean, some would call it semi-proletarianized. I don't believe that these categories are particularly useful, and more than a labeling, they don't do much. But basically, 45% of them, they'll still own land back home, and still this land has a reproductive role to play in the process of their overall reproduction. They can only live in the industrial colonies for a period of time. They'll go back home, particularly because retrenched or because of wrecking service. And so the village will continue sort of being a fundamental substitute to capital, and it continues sort of being able to reproduce this particularly highly flexible labor process. Here instead you have that the reproductive arrangements are more classically defined around domestic productions with either home workers in their own dwellings, or instead the household as a unit of analysis that speak to some of the conceptualization that Jens talked about this morning. So there are just already very fruitful ways we can have when we look at the concrete ways in which exploitation manifests, where we can combine insights from an approach that recognizes the different forms in which exploitation can manifest with the social reproduction linkages that are crucial for us to understand how certain types of labor relation can be further and be regenerated. And to me, particularly this last point speaks very loudly about the role that social reproduction actually plays under capitalism in relation to processes of value generation. So this is very much instead the original contribution that I was supposed to give, and the different ways in which I think that not only the housework debate presented us with a key insight on how we have to understand value, but I would say that these key insights can be utilized and scaled up today to think through the ways in which we observe the spread and intensification of informal and informalized labor relations. In relation to the different forms in which exploitation takes place, social reproduction belongs and activities perform a different role and are incorporated into the, they participate in processes of value generations in different ways. So when it comes to factory wage labor, we have two ways in which social reproductive realms actually directly contribute to the expansion of the rates of exploitation. The first is through the expansion of labor control beyond labor time, well into the dormitories and the industrial hamlets where the workers live. And there's a great deal of literature that comes from China, of course, the work of people like Punai and Chris Smith, but we also see exciting new studies that are covering the Czech Republic or Vietnam. Of course, for India, we work slightly differently because we don't have dormitories, but still the relations that we observe between realms of daily reproduction of the workforce and the actual exploitation that goes on in the factory is tightly interlinked for at least the process of what Hannah Schling called the production of compliant workers whose rate of exploitation can be expanded. Now, the second way in which this happens is that for a factory wage workforce is the way in which intergenerational reproductive realm, like the village or the colony in this case, continues absorbing the cost of the externalization of reproductive costs by capital, and so it works as a subsidy to capital, very much as housework in the early debate was conceived as a subsidy to capital in relation to the industrial workforce and in relation to the industrial wage. Now, when it comes to instead the home-based work, so that will be your free form, free form of work. That's a different way in which exploitation manifests. I would say that instead the ways in which production and social reproduction enmesh already poses the distinction between what is value producing and what is non-value producing in the actual lives and works and consumption of this particular working class is impossible to make. So you can only actually see social reproductive realms and activities as directly value producing, or indeed this is the argument I make in this article. So what I'm left with now is to provide some sort of reflection on the benefits of looking at the ways in which insights on social reproduction also contribute to our understanding of labor and freedom, which is yet another key insight that comes from Jairus' theorization. And I would say that one of the main contributions by Jairus to the debate on unfreedom is to set, well, first the fiction of free labor under capitalism as a starting point, and then to highlight how effectively you can have separation, like processes of dispossession and separation from the means of production as well as debt, as an entry point into a discussion about freedom. However, I would say that while this sets the beginning of the debate, it also sort of set perhaps its limitations. So the Marxian debate on freedom basically generally refers to a sort of genderless individual or individual that is not necessarily located in a social milieu. And as a matter of fact, this results in a number of problems when it comes then to this theorization of unfreedom, because that remains very much anchored in the realm of economic relations. And this also explains, I would say, in the literature, this insistence on debt as the fundamental ways in which we can understand or like distinguish between supposedly free and supposedly unfree laborers. Already Jens gave us a sense, and I'd say there are many others that do work in India and elsewhere that actually provide this type of empirical observation, the fact that the ways in which that structure lies, well, it has to be indeed taken it has to be a key empirical question for all those of us that work on labor relation. It's also not something that can be given for granted in relation to its links to actual livelihoods. And I would say that here, the incorporation of insights from the social reproduction debate is crucial to gender and racialize the debate. When we talk about real experiences of dispossession, these never occur first and foremost around issues of death. There are always very specific people that experience dispossession. There are always very specific social profile of the people that experience death. And that is quite clear in relation to land, which generally target indigenous communities, is clear in Silvia's work on early development of capitalism with reference to women. But I would say that also increasingly obvious in other types of literature that is coming out and is looking at property relations and initial dispossessions of people from realms of value or property. So we can think about Brenna Bandar's work on colonial of property that looked at the ways in which settler colonial regimes have actually excluded prime nations people from owning and inheriting land across North America. So in a sense, also when we dealt with our own findings and tried to compare the experiences of workers that experienced bondage, i.e. they received advances, and so they were technically tied to a specific contractors were those that were technically free, we just found a number of inconsistencies with the literature that assumes that death is the primary lens through which we should judge actually these relations. And this because unfreedom is not primarily an economic relation. Unfreedom is rooted in social oppression, and that is one of the many possible manifestations in which this can actually take place. And as a matter of fact, quite surprisingly, when I was researching the sweatshop regime, it was quite clear to me after a certain point that those that actually are bonded by the contractors are those that the contractors want to link to his own networks for specific reasons, and they tend to be more skilled workers and definitely male workers, so that the relation of credit actually serves the purpose of interlocking the worker into the web of the contractor. And of course it is that relation which I think is relevant, and I might differ in my conclusions and ends, because we found an incredible variation in terms of that level, ranging from 5,000 rupees all the way to 500,000. But still, it's only one way in which it manifests. So for instance, when we talked with the women, and particularly the women home workers, we realized that none of them was in fact neo-bonded. And this is because women in the areas we study already practice purda. They cannot actually leave the confines of the household or the street, so there is only a few contractors that will offer them work. And so the contractor doesn't really need to offer a credit transaction to actually interlock them or bond them to their network. So in this case, reproductive unfreedoms in the form of patriarchal unfreedom is the one that defines women's lives. And when we looked at low caste workers, also we saw that not only you had this exclusion from realms of credit, but you have a devaluation of the rates that they could be paid to them on the basis of stigma, which of course in India, in the context of the present Hinduization of the subcontinent, is actually escalating and calls for what the Indian feminist Marie John calls a labor theory of stigma. So that you have that, in this case, freedom is rooted in social oppression, exceeds the realm of economic relation, and also becomes a sort of performance in humiliation for certain and degrading work for a number of categories of people. So in a sense, I think while in the previous examples that I gave, I just traced the ways in which insights from using the categories, forms of exploitation, and combining it with social reproduction can illuminate many ways in which exploitation then is experienced in practice, and the ways in which we can enlarge the boundaries on how to study it in relation to unfreedom. As a matter of fact, I think that the debate on forms of exploitation can learn an awful lot from the social reproductive debate, because it really has to flip the issue of what really unfreedom means, and it starts first and foremost as a reproductive experience to then become an economic one. So I hope I just try to sort of show you a number of fruitful ways in which we can combine insights from a take that recognizes the variation with which exploitation can manifest, with insights on social reproduction. And to me this is a very exciting agenda, combining insights from Marxism and Feminism in a way that are non-dogmatic, and recognizing capitalism as a complex mode of production which is structured and experienced differently across the world system. And to me this sort of joint understanding, sort of combined framework, drawing from political economy and feminist insights is particularly useful in understanding the world of informal and informalized labor. And I think this is a crucial agenda, considering that the last ILO estimates talk about 61.9% of the world labor relations being informal or informalized, with peaks of 85% in Africa and 93% in India, but even with the rest of the world actually experiencing work and labor in these particular ways. To me, the insights just speaks about the ways in which we have to see the social profile of the workers as central to the way in which exploitation is experienced, and also the ways in which then exploitation itself then is able to be perpetuated on the basis of different reproductive arrangements, and also for the insights on value and on freedom that a sort of integrated framework based on forms of exploitation and social reproduction gives. And questioning the boundaries of exploitation has huge political as well as policy implications, and I think this is the reason why it's something to stress, and I find it an intellectually worthy agenda, exactly because I find it a politically necessary agenda. And there are all sorts of implications this has in the ways in which we conceptualize struggle, and I definitely, I would say, agree with Andres in collapsing the division between productive and reproductive struggles. That makes absolutely no sense. In fact, in certain contexts, it's just really, you have to explain to people what you mean with the labor struggle that doesn't stretch all the ways to dormitories. And also in relation to how we think policy, there's a huge lot to be said, but I leave that for the Q&A. Thanks.